Hi, my name is John Chorley, the Group Vice President of Oracle's Supply Chain Product Strategy, and welcome to this Oracle Live session on how to integrate and accelerate planning to navigate risk and uncertainty using Oracle Supply Chain Planning Cloud. We've got a great program, including segments from the distinguished analyst Simon Ellis of IDC and an interview with our customer Juniper Networks. Let's begin. We are in a period of unprecedented disruptive supply chain events, creating risk and uncertainty, of which COVID is just the most immediate example. These are combined with ever-increasing customer expectations and a host of other changes and pressures. Yet most organizations are unable to keep pace, creating a widening latency and capability gap. To shrink this gap, businesses must switch from keeping the lights on to driving innovation. The keys to integrate and accelerate planning and to navigate sustained risk and uncertainty are to have decision data that is complete, current, and high quality, decision speed, which is proactive, connected, and granular, decision alignment, which combines strategy alignment, customer centricity, and is multi-tier, and decision automation that is business metric driven with consistently known cause and effect. And this is what Supply Chain Planning Cloud delivers. Supply chain visibility, comprehensive ability to assimilate disparate demand and supply data from multiple sources. An end-to-end supply chain model with segmentation, real-time interactive planning, and aggregate and detailed decisions. Connected planning with unified planning for strategic and tactical decisions, demand-driven inventory and fulfillment policies, and multi-tier collaboration. And automated resolution, using predictive business insights and guided problem resolution, prescribed actions, and automated execution of strategic and tactical decisions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Simon Ellis, Program Vice President at IDC, who I've had the pleasure of working with for many years. Simon is responsible for providing research, analysis, and guidance on key business and IT issues for manufacturers. He currently leads Supply Chain Strategies practice at IDC Manufacturing Insights, where amongst other things, Simon is directly responsible for the research in the Supply Chain Planning Strategies practice. Simon, well, this is an unprecedented time we are going through. As Lisa Chalette at Morgan Stanley said, we've never, ever seen a sudden stop of the economy worldwide. This crisis will be an experiment to understand what the companies are that have a true resilient and recurring revenue stream. I understand that you had just initiated a survey on supply chain planning priorities as this crisis hit. Great timing. Please share some of the insights from that survey.
Of course, I'd be happy to, and a pleasure to speak with you today. And I guess this is how we're going to do these things for the immediate future. Yeah, so I do a supply chain survey every 2 years. And it was fortuitous that the most recent version of the survey was actually in the field this past April. So there are a number of things that we've asked progressively over the course of time. COVID, of course, not one of them. That was new this year to all of us. And we saw some interesting things, right? We saw, you noted and mentioned resiliency and supply chain resiliency certainly has been one of my favored topics for a while now. And it's, in some ways, it's kind of become the term for 2020, hasn't it? And in the survey, when we asked, for example, companies to identify, what were the critical gaps that they saw in their supply chain, that if they didn't fix them, would be really problematic for them in the future. And supply chain resiliency was number one. In the old days, supply chain was a cost center, right? I think of it very much now as an opportunity center, maybe a bit of a goofy term, but, companies who haven't thought about supply chain planning, who haven't thought about transforming their supply chains, I think they'll find themselves disadvantaged. In that same survey, we asked about, the idea of kind of digital supply chain opportunities, right? And it was things like robotics, certainly, but it was collaboration platforms and planning, integrated supply chain planning platforms and ecosystems and networks. But at the end of the day, it's beginning, I think, John, the process of pulling these together and leveraging the power of all of these technologies in the context, of platforms and of ecosystems.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think your point about bringing things together really speaks a lot to one of the strengths we see in planning, but also in particular in the Oracle supply chain planning solutions. And that is the ability to really perform integrated business planning and bring together different aspects of the company so that you can share common ideas, common facts, and create and craft a response to them.
Yeah. You know, I think so. So I couldn't agree more. So one of the things, and it's, I suppose, John, it's been a bit of a pet peeve of mine that as we've talked about supply chains over the course of the last 3 months, so much of the focus has been on the supply side.
Yeah.
I understand why factories have closed, regions have shut down, but I also think that the demand side is a critical piece, and I don't think you can think and talk about supply without also considering demand. You can't talk about demand without also considering supply. And so this idea of, you know, demand planning separate from supply planning, separate from S&OP, just doesn't make sense anymore. I think you need this integrated platform, because if you don't have it, you're going to find yourself sub-optimized compared to folks who do.
Yeah, and I think that there's maybe a thought that, black swan events, if you like that phrase,
Yeah.
like COVID,
Yeah.
they undermine the traditional idea of planning, in particular demand forecasting. But I know you and I have discussed that. There are ways to
Yeah.
manage that,
Yeah.
those challenges. Perhaps you can speak to that.
Yeah, you know, so you know, people talk about COVID as a, you know, as a once in a century event, once in a lifetime event. Hopefully it is, but there are plenty of other kinds of disruptions that we've seen, whether it's volcanoes, whether it's earthquakes, whether it's floods. And so I think, you know, the black swan event, unfortunately, is becoming more and more prevalent. And so I think we have to start thinking about forecasting and demand sensing and demand planning in the context of how do we start to understand these unusual, I use this term unusual, these unusual variables, right? How do we think about the things that perhaps we've not traditionally built into forecasting, because I think they're going to be more important. I think they're going to be more relevant. I mean, you know, you're the chief sustainability officer of Oracle. Climate change is potentially a huge problem for the supply chain, particularly when you think about the ability to source ingredients and components. And I just think if we're going to think differently about the supply chain from a supply and demand perspective, we have to be able to build in these kinds of unusual triggers of demand, both up and down.
Are there some specific strategies that you would suggest that people look at, that adopt, and maybe some stories about examples that you've seen in your engagement with customers?
Yeah, you know, so I think it's, I mean, you know, in a way, John, it kind of goes back to this idea of resiliency, right? And so, you know, I think about, and maybe this is a little simplistic, but I think about, you know, visibility plus agility equals resiliency, right? So if I see what's happening, but I can't do anything about it, I'm not resilient. If I've got enormous capacity to do something about it, but I don't see it, I'm not resilient, right? And so I think what we've seen, and it depends a lot on the industry, right? If you were unlucky enough to be in an industry that got hugely impacted on the demand side, probably no matter how resilient your supply chain was, you know, you still got hit hard. So I think the examples for me at least are, you know, companies who saw early, but then had the ability, whether it was crisis management teams, whether it was the kind of black swan predictive events and the ability to build those into the supply chain planning process. I think those were the kinds of companies that have performed better and will perform better in the future.
Yeah, and I think there are ways in which you can fine tune your demand forecasting process to accommodate these causal factors, so that you can skew them towards understanding the role of, scarcity driven demand versus true increase in demand or reduction in demand, and then plan accordingly.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I mean, we all saw the paper products shortage, right, in March and April. You know, much of that was, as you precisely note, it was scarcity driven. It was in some ways hoarding, right? And versus, you know, if you were selling pressure treated lumber or you were selling barbecue briquettes, people staying home, they're spending more time on their decks, they're barbecuing more. That's real demand. And so you're exactly right. I think the challenge for us in the supply chain is how do we differentiate between something that's got a short-term scarcity-driven bump versus true increases in demand in the longer term.
Absolutely. And if you had to pinpoint an area for investment for any given company to think about, how to position themselves well to do well after this recovery hopefully kicks in, what would that be? Are there specific areas that you'd focus on?
So I'm a supply chain planning guy first and foremost. So I think I've always said if you don't get supply chain planning right, you don't get the supply chain right. I mean, for me, I think it's ultimately about agility, right? I think that we have all of this data coming at us, volumes, variety, unstructured, structured. Some companies have leveraged it better than others, but everybody's leveraged it at least to some degree, right? So we have all of this data coming at us. I think the question is, can we do anything with it, right? So I think how we look at inventory optimization, how we look at supply linked demand planning, I think are all areas, for me at least, where companies ought to focus. I'm not dismissing the importance of transportation and warehousing and global trade, but I do think, again, if you don't get planning right, you don't get the rest of that stuff right either. And so for me, at least as a long-term supply chain planning guy, it really is very much around agility and supply chain planning driven agility.
Yeah, and creating a culture within your organization that incorporates inputs from all of the different lines of business through an integrated business planning process.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Well, you did mention a little bit about technology. Are there any, switching gears maybe a little bit, IoT, blockchain, AI, ML, there's a lot of that kind of conversation going around.
Yeah.
What are you really seeing in terms of adoption, and what areas do you think offer the most promise?
Yeah. So one of the questions, as you can probably imagine, right? One of the questions that we asked in the survey, the supply chain survey, was kind of, what did companies think about these technologies in the context of their supply chains? One was AI. I've been, I'm certainly not an AI expert, but I am a supply chain expert, and I think that we've seen some really very interesting early applications of AI, particularly in forecasting and the ability to leverage these kinds of capabilities. We've seen AI help an awful lot in data quality and data governance in the supply chain. And so AI was actually the technology that showed the biggest jump, right? So when we asked companies how important it was today, and some companies don't understand what it means really, some do, but when we asked about what it looks like in 3 years, that had the biggest jump. So AI appears to be the thing that holds the most promise, at least in terms of the survey.
Well, it's been fantastic talking with you, Simon. I really appreciate your insights. It's great to see you again, only by Zoom. And thank you very much for your contribution to this Oracle Live session.
It's my pleasure. And perhaps next year we'll get to do this in person. Right?
I hope so. Very much.
Thank you, John. Pleasure.
Now let's hear from some of our customers.
Domestically, we have about 6,000 customers, and through our branches and our departments within the corporation, we're doing operations in 26 countries around the world.
Brismed's an innovative company. It's the need to be able to have products where they're needed, when they're needed, to manage our inventory.
At Ledestri, our supply chain is actually very complex. We produce over 1,000 different products across our 24 production lines. There's no way you can do it on a paper basis.
Because we have so many items, it's a little difficult to keep all of them in stock all the time, and we need to know when we can promise for those.
We use Oracle as our backbone for our supply chain and really our production process. We've been able to save more than $2 million through disposals by having the visibility that we needed.
When we went to demand in the cloud, we rethought our entire demand planning process. So we rethought our organizational structure, our forecasting, our methodology. It's an opportunity to basically evolve.
Our team loves it. It really gives them visibility that they never had before. We look at Oracle being a key partner in that journey forward.
Having the name Oracle behind the product definitely gave us confidence and credibility to go into a product that we knew we could trust in. One thing that we're really proud of right out the gate of our implementation is we've already seen an 81.5% increase in our on-time shipments. The cloud gives us tools that we never had before, and we would never have that opportunity to go forward.
Now let's talk with a great customer of Oracle Supply Chain Planning Cloud, Juniper Networks, one of the world's leading high-tech companies that develops and markets the networking products that enable our connected world. From Juniper, Mitch Haynes, Senior Director, Supply Chain Planning, and Kiran Galapati, Senior Director, IT Applications for Juniper Networks. Welcome. First, Mitch, can you give us an overview of the Juniper supply chain and the planning processes?
Sure. Thanks, John. It's good to be with you today. So Juniper Networks is, I think, what we classically describe as a high mix, low volume type company. We've got a pretty broad ranging portfolio over routing, switching, and security appliances that, as you mentioned, kind of go into, the networking world that is making, communications like this possible today. So our planning landscape is that we are an outsourced manufacturing model. We sense demand from our customers in conversations with sales, with marketing, and seeing what's taking place in the sales pipeline, and then set a plan for the next 5 quarters at an individual product level that then gets issued back to our supply base. And we drive materials against that, bring them into our contract manufacturing partners, and then execute builds based on the way we see demand materializing. So obviously, as you know, in our industry right now, lead times are doing anything but getting shorter, right? Whether it's more complex silicon or challenges around industry and trade, that ability to see demand out into the future is really key, but then to drive supply alignment against that. And so that's kind of the landscape that we work in, and obviously the associated challenges therein.
Yeah, and obviously a challenging time, and we've had a few conversations about that, but can you describe the importance of integrated business planning and sales and operations planning during these times of disruptive events such as COVID, trade tensions, weather-related events?
For me, this last year has felt like just the most incredible time to be in the supply chain that I can remember. We went from a world in, kind of February to a world in March where we had to deliver school and businesses online for people. That's a lot more video and a lot more traffic passing across our network. So kind of a big increase there. But then obviously the macroeconomic environment, is challenging. And so we've seen other areas of the business in enterprise that have been maybe a little bit more challenging. And so how we react to that, how we can align with our partners that are on the front lines of selling on an everyday basis to get the right material to our customers when they need it, is been a very big challenge for us. And I would say, probably wouldn't have been successful without the changes that we started to put in place here over the last couple of years. We probably would have not done as well as we would have, or as we did in the last year.
Yeah, you mentioned to me, I think, that rather than customers trying to adopt the latest new thing, there was a demand shift to more of their existing products because they needed to deploy that quickly and couldn't necessarily invest in a technology evaluation.
Exactly. We definitely saw a lot of cases where customers, just like all of us are taking, kind of this conference from home or a remote workplace, getting into a lab and physically touching hardware and qualifying that new piece of equipment to be deployed, kind of in your network is something that has slowed down. And so what we have to do is rely on those tested technologies that have worked in the past and will work in the future. And so we did see demand shift a little bit from, kind of more of a new product portfolio to an existing product portfolio, and had to make changes, kind of in the way that we were planning for supply and demand there.
Okay. Well, switching to the technology side, Kiran, what were some of the key factors you considered and benefits you see in moving from an on-premise based solution to a SaaS and cloud?
Hey, John, thanks for the question. So Juniper has a cloud-first strategy. What it means is anything that we build homegrown needs to be cloud enabled or cloud native. And all vendor applications, we look for SaaS capabilities, right? So that's been the premise. We started looking into the right supply chain planning system. And then we evaluated multiple products and looked into Oracle Supply Chain Cloud. And the key benefits of being on SaaS, not only the reduction in total cost of ownership, there is 99% availability of the system, the new features coming on a quarterly basis, availability of industry 4.0 technology like AI, blockchain, IoT, etc., and easy access to all our Juniper employees as well as our CM partners through federated controls.
Yeah, and I know that Juniper has, at least at present, a back-end ERP system based on SAP. So what were some of the considerations in adopting Oracle Cloud technology together with your SAP ERP system?
Yeah, we didn't go with an obvious choice. We looked into the capabilities. In fact, our business has written a 60 or 65 page BRD, all credit to Mitch and team. So the BRD has a comprehensive view of what we needed. It's not just about a planning system, but needs to have the execution part as well, the order management capabilities, having visibility to backlog, etc. Right? So we looked into the rich feature set that Oracle SCM Cloud was offering. Then our obvious question was, how do we integrate to our Juniper systems? We did have systems like SAP ERP, CRM, SFDC for opportunities. Then that was an important evaluation criteria. We looked into Oracle. What are the integration options? So web services is the key here. Everybody thinks how to integrate SAP or Oracle, but really here the key is web services. I think with rich set of REST APIs that were provided, things were easy. Yeah.
That's great to hear. So I know that we've worked closely with Juniper and forged a strong technology partnership, which I think can be a good model for other customers. So can you share the breadth of your deployment and how you've worked together with the Oracle team?
We selected Trinomics as our implementation partner. It has been an exceptional collaboration all through, right? In fact, Oracle was part of our steering committee. In fact, we collaborated to the extent that we found a gap on backlog management where we collaborated and got our requirements from ground up. The whole backlog management was built by Oracle with tight partnership with us.
Well, to close, can you share with the audience some ways in which Juniper might use Industry 4.0 technology to improve your supply chain management? Mitch, perhaps begin with you. From a business perspective, what benefits might the types of technologies bring?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we look at the future of planning, we see the artificial intelligence, machine learning landscape being one of the most critical areas that we can invest in. The ability to kind of work and develop some very unique solutions in this space that are deployed in the Oracle platform as a service that allow us to tune our investment strategy really in inventory, right? Whether that's driving a little bit of extra demand or driving some component safety stocks at the right place in our network, using, kind of learning in language that is really critical to Juniper is really important. And so the ability to kind of make that a part of our day-to-day, which is, right now we are deploying some of these, kind of as we speak, and getting some of these new technologies out there. I think that's going to be a really big part of how we are successful in the future.
Kieran, from a technology perspective, how does SaaS help make these things practical?
We went through a phased approach of implementing first supply planning, global order processing, And then we implemented S&OP, went on to backlog management and demand management cloud. So the key architectural element here is the common data model. So we also integrated our CM partners. So there's rich amount of data we are getting into here, and availability of some of the AI inbuilt algorithms like product segmentation. We have used that algorithm to segregate our products based on high intermittency and variability. And that would help our planners to go and target the right products and spend the right amount of time. And there's quite a bit of benefits from the architecture we have enabled.
That's fantastic. Yeah, our goal is, of course, to build these technologies into our solutions, make them readily and easily available, so that as a business, you can take advantage of them and implement them quickly as a business process within your company. Anyway, I want to thank you folks at Juniper for being a customer of the Oracle Supply Chain Planning Cloud. And thank you in particular, Kieran and Mitch, for sharing your experiences with us today.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
So the time is now. My name is John Chorley, and thank you for attending this session.